Hey guys, tonight we are drifting into the delightfully dry world of Roman bread stamps, a world where bureaucracy met baked goods, and somehow society managed to function on a doughy infrastructure. Imagine warm, crusty loaves, not as delicious treats, but as tiny, edible filing cabinets, each one dutifully marked with information more suited to a tax form than a picnic. You probably won't survive this, not because it's dangerous, but because your brain might politely check out halfway through a debate on imperial grain quotas. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're awake enough, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love seeing where in the world people are dozing off. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're moving through the heart of ancient Rome, and all around you is the sound of a city just trying to stay fed, not with five-star meals or culinary invention, but with bread. Glorious, simple, state-regulated bread. The grain ships have just come in from Alexandria, their hulls stuffed with wheat grown under the hot Egyptian sun. Rome needs that grain like you need sleep right now constantly, and preferably without interruption. The city's population, over 1 million strong at its peak, cannot survive without careful, often excruciatingly tedious organization of food supplies. And the central feature of that system, bread. Now, imagine being responsible for that. You're not a baker. No, you're one of the unlucky souls stationed in the Praefectus Annoni's office, a place where scrolls outnumber smiles and every missing sack of flour is a possible criminal case. Your day begins in a storeroom, squinting at tallied lists on wax tablets while trying not to trip over sacks of moldy millet, grain delivery schedules, community baking shifts, regional allocation ledgers. It's less Julia Child and more spreadsheet in Latin. See, the empire had a problem. It promised free or subsidized bread to a huge swath of citizens through the grain dole, or cura annoni. That meant grain had to be received, stored, milled, baked, and distributed all on a tight schedule and tighter oversight, which means that the ovens— oh yes, the sacred public ovens ran like clockwork. And they weren't just for anyone. If you were a private citizen baking your own artisanal loaf, sure, go ahead. But if you were baking with state-distributed grain, especially the free allotment intended for Rome's poor, that loaf had to be accounted for. Every single one. And so, the bread stamp was born, not for flair or marketing, but because someone needed to know who baked what, when, with whose grain, and for whom. If it sounds like overkill, it absolutely was. But in a city where someone could get stabbed over stale crusts, accuracy mattered. You walk through a side street where a public oven's fires crackle behind a low stone arch. There's soot on everything, and the baker's assistant, covered in flour from nose to sandals, slides a paddle in to retrieve a fresh batch. He checks each loaf before stacking them in a basket, making sure the bottom bears a faint but legible imprint. The stamp might say, Emilius, 4C, Cornelius, District 7, or something equally thrilling. Sometimes it just read panis, Latin for bread, which is like labeling a chair. But in a bureaucratic world, redundancy was reassurance. Even the shape and weight of the loaves could be standardized. The round, ridged Roman loaf you sometimes see in museums, that design wasn't an aesthetic choice. It made the loaves easier to divide into equal portions. 8 wedges, 8 servings. Like a pizza, but sadder. And then there were quotas. Every district in Rome had its own expectations how much grain it received, how many loaves it was to produce, and on what schedule. And heaven help the administrator who ran short. Bread riots were not theoretical. They happened. And they could bring down careers faster than you can say burnt crust. So imagine this. It's Tuesday morning, and the 4th grain ship is late. A district goes short. Bread is delayed. The oven's cool. A few hundred citizens don't get their expected ration. Word spreads. Someone blames corruption. The Praefectus Annoni is summoned. A formal complaint is filed. The baker who accidentally misstamped 20 loaves is suddenly at the center of a minor scandal, and all you wanted was a sandwich. But this was Rome. They didn't do casual. Bread wasn't food, it was a state service. Historians still argue whether these controls were more about feeding the poor or keeping the peace. Was this a gesture of care or a way to pacify the masses with the ancient equivalent of subsidized carbs? Either way, the bread kept coming, and it kept getting stamped. There's a record of one baker who received an official commendation for the clarity and consistency of his stampings. No joke. Imagine your performance review being based on legibility in dough. It's the Roman version of winning best font use in Microsoft Word. You pause now in front of a stall where loaves are cooling, and a small boy, perhaps a baker's son, is using a lump of clay to press sample stamps. He's practicing. Because even children learn the bureaucracy early. The grown-ups had amphorae to label, the kids had crusts to mark. And so, beneath the grandeur of Rome's temples and the roar of its arenas, there was the soft, unending rhythm of bread being kneaded, baked, and most critically stamped. You're still in that alley near the communal oven, and now your attention is drawn not to the warm scent of freshly baked loaves, but to the strange, repetitive sound of something being tapped against a wooden table. It's not rhythmic, exactly more like the distracted clunk of someone pressing a carved object over and over again into a lump of dough. That's when you notice the baker's apprentice, a teenager with tired eyes and a permanently flour-dusted nose, holding what looks like a squat, ugly spool. It's the bread stamp, and he's using it like his life depends on it. Because, in a very Roman way, it sort of does. Stamped loaves weren't just decoration or baker's pride. They were a legal requirement for anyone using public ovens or state-distributed grain. That little impression on the bottom of a loaf, it was your compliance badge, your bakery license, ration record, and audit trail all rolled into one rough patch of baked Latin. No stamp, no loaf, or worse, loaf confiscated, fines imposed, maybe even some very serious side-eye from the local Vico Magistri. The stamps themselves were usually carved from clay or wood, though the more ambitious or wealthier bakers opted for metal. They had to be reverse engraved, of course, so the impression read correctly once pressed into the dough. It's a small detail, but imagine trying to carve your boss's full name backwards into terracotta with a dull stylus. After a 10-hour shift kneading bread in a Roman summer, that's a level of dedication modern office workers rarely achieve unless there's free pizza involved. The messages were typically brief names, abbreviations, perhaps a number, something like Pomponifeps or Prime Vits X Pris ASCVS. Some simply read Panis ad PVBL to indicate public bread. Occasionally, a number showed the batch or quota. The goal wasn't beauty, it was legibility. You squint at one of the stamps now, freshly pressed into a cooling loaf. It's uneven, the lettering a bit smudged, but you can make out most of it. IUL Max. That's Quintus Julius Maximus, or someone pretending to be him. That possibility that someone might fake a stamp to claim someone else's allocation isn't lost on the nervous apprentice nearby. Because bread wasn't just bread, it was currency. It was civic duty. It was surveillance. This leads to a delightful irony. For all its grandeur and marble toga drama, the Roman Empire also had food inspectors, people whose job was to check bread bottoms every day, carefully, maybe even a little obsessively. Not quite the glamorous life, but certainly essential. The empire's stomach was its lifeline, and every stamped loaf had to pass inspection. Historians still argue whether these stamps were tracked systematically, or if it was more of a look busy and make sure it smells like bread sort of regulation. Some believe bakers were registered and issued official stamps by local authorities. Others suggest stamp designs were more ad hoc, passed down like family secrets or forged when convenience trumped honesty. There's even debate over whether consumers could recognize bakers by their stamp impressions, sort of like ancient Yelp, but without the star ratings or photos. You pass a cart stacked high with stamped loaves, the wheels creaking as it trundles toward a poor district's distribution point. The baker pushing it doesn't look thrilled. His stamp has been acting up again. One of the carved letters keeps chipping, and the resulting imprint now looks like Panis ad PBL, which, frankly, could get him fined for misleading labeling. Yes, in a world where gladiators fought to the death, and emperors demanded temples in their own honor, mislabeling your bread was still a serious enough offense to trigger a full-on scroll-based investigation. One surviving example, a charred loaf from Pompeii, stamped Sealer SL Surge indicates not only the name of the slave who baked it, Sealer, but also his master, Sergius. That tells us a lot. Baking wasn't always voluntary, and bread stamps served as a mechanism of control as well as accountability. If your loaf burned, fell apart, or went missing, the stamp made sure someone could be blamed. There's a fringe theory, unconfirmed but surprisingly sticky, that some bakers developed personal flair in their stamps. A quirky little curl on the S, a stylized fish mark, a hidden dot to indicate sourdough. These minor flourishes weren't sanctioned. Of course, they were private jokes, little acts of rebellion, or perhaps a baker's way of reminding themselves that they were still a person, not just a bread machine. And then there's the oddity of seasonal stamps. In rare archaeological digs, historians have found variations in stamps that seem to change with festivals or imperial birthdays, like an ancient version of limited edition packaging. Happy Saturnalia. Here's your loaf. Perhaps these were gestures of goodwill. Perhaps they were yet more regulations handed down from someone very far away who didn't have to actually carve the thing. The Romans, after all, loved recording things. Tally sticks, wax tablets, inscriptions, scrolls. So many scrolls. Stamped bread was just another log in the grand fire of record-keeping, another bit of edible compliance. And what of the stamp makers themselves? Not the bakers, but the ones who carve these tiny bureaucratic instruments. That's where things get really niche. Some appear to have been dedicated craftsmen, producing stamps not just for bakers, but for potters, amphora sealers, and fabric merchants. There may have even been a small but fussy guild for stamp engravers, though no formal proof exists. You stop at a workbench now, watching an older man lean over a small disc of damp clay. He mutters to himself, testing backward letters with a bit of soot rubbed on his fingertips. He's trying to get the curves just right, not for beauty, for clarity, so that the next loaf that comes out of the oven can pass inspection and make its way safely to the hungry hands waiting in the subura. Somewhere behind him, the oven bellows smoke and heat. The rhythm of Rome continues. Loaves go in, stamps go on, and the gears of empire grind slowly forward, powered not just by conquest, but by bread. Carefully labeled, precisely stamped, dutifully distributed bread. You've wandered deeper now away from the scent of flour and smoke into the administrative corridors of Rome's grain empire. And yes, they were corridors, not glamorous marble halls, but narrow offices tucked behind markets and granaries, filled with the rustle of papyrus and the distant hum of disputes over flour weight. Here resides the office of the panis, or, more formally, the network of bureaucrats tied to the cura and noni. Rome's system for controlling the supply of grain and the distribution of bread. The man in charge, the praefectus annone, a title that rolls off the tongue like stale dough but held immense power. He didn't command legions or oversee temples. He controlled food, which, for Rome, was arguably more important. You picture him now, perhaps a bit sunburned, perpetually scowling, holding a wax tablet in one hand and a stylus in the other, muttering things like, "Tell Ostia to check the barge manifests again," or "Why is District 6 short 2 sacks of spelt?" The praefectus annoni was appointed by the emperor and often came from the equestrian class, wealthy, but not quite senatorial. Think of him as a middle manager with life-or-death responsibilities and an allergy to chaos. His job, everything. He coordinated the arrival of grain from Egypt and Sicily. He oversaw storage in the great Horea massive grain warehouses, some the size of city blocks. He organized the grain dole for citizens, ensured fair prices, mediated between bakers and millers, and most relevant to us, enforced stamping regulations, because Rome didn't just care that you made bread, it cared how you made it, when you made it, and which stamp you used to prove it. In the files of the praefectus, somewhere beneath scrolls detailing seasonal yields and harbor-rot complaints, there would be records, tedious, ink-blotted records of which bakers had been issued, which stamp designs, some with initials, others with abbreviations, a few with odd little symbols for bakeries that couldn't afford full Latin engravings. Historians still argue whether bakers were issued one stamp for life, like a loaf-shaped social security number, or if they had to reapply annually. There's evidence of both. A few loaves from Pompeii suggest bakers had different stamps across months, maybe indicating a rotating schedule, or just the result of overused clay molds cracking in the heat. Regardless, the stamps were logged, just like temple donations, just like military enrollments, just like everything in Rome that mattered. You shuffle now past a junior scribe, barely 16, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, who's tasked with reviewing the weekly Panis report. His wax tablet contains a list of names, each followed by tally marks, and a column noting any irregularities. He sighs deeply as he writes, "Loaves without full stamp from Domitius again." You can feel the soul slowly seeping out of him. And then there's the stamp complaint scroll. Yes, that was real. Some districts had an official complaint ledger, specifically for bread stamp disputes, like when the stamp was illegible, or when a loaf meant for a particular citizen bore someone else's name. Or, most dramatically, when two loaves claimed to come from the same baker but had different stamps. Scandalous. You read one entry in your mind. Loaf bearing the name of Gaius Brutus appears to have come from a separate oven, based on texture and uneven flour content. Suggest inspection of stamp integrity. A sleepy part of your brain wonders what kind of person noticed flour texture and still found the energy to lodge a formal grievance. Welcome to Rome. Yet this wasn't paranoia, it was civic duty. Every stamped loaf was a cog in a carefully managed system, and any irregularity could point to fraud, favoritism, or worse, diverted grain. In a city where the emperor's popularity hinged on whether the breadlines moved quickly, you didn't take shortcuts, you took stamps. The Praefectus Annoni had the power to fine bakers, to revoke their access to public ovens, to summon them for interrogation. Some days, he probably wished he could just take a long nap in a grain sack, a lesser-known fact. Some prefecti even dabbled in stamp design, or, more likely, approved new templates. One scholar noted a particularly elaborate stamp complete with a curved border and tiny stalks of wheat, which might have been the result of an overachieving clerk trying to impress his superior. Or maybe someone just got bored and added flair, a bit like using Comic Sans on a tax form. One of the more fringe tidbits that's floated around among food historians is that the Praefectus Annoni occasionally visited bakeries in disguise to inspect their stamp usage firsthand. There's no concrete evidence for this, but it persists, perhaps born from a strange combination of civic legend and everyone's collective fear of surprise audits. You pass another room in the office, where rejected stamps sit in a dusty corner, slightly cracked, miscarved, or just wrong. One has the letter Q where there clearly should be a G. Another was abandoned halfway through, perhaps the carver sneezed mid-stroke and gave up entirely. Bureaucracy leaves behind artifacts like this, tiny monuments to over-regulation and human error. And perhaps that's what makes it all oddly comforting. The idea that people 2,000 years ago spent their days worrying about paperwork, stamp alignment, and the correct order of letters in a loaf of bread. The empire may have ruled much of the known world, but even it couldn't escape the tyranny of bread logistics. As you step outside the office, the warm sun returns, and you find yourself looking at bread in an entirely different way, not just as food, but as form, function, and evidence. A loaf isn't just a loaf. It's a declaration, a fingerprint, a state-approved symbol of nourishment, compliance, and the deep Roman desire for order even in a dinner roll. You've followed the trail of bureaucracy from the office to the oven, and now your feet crunch softly over a mosaic floor as you enter a quiet workshop tucked behind the bakery district. There's no fire here, no scent of warm flour, just the faint smell of damp clay and the meticulous hush of concentration. This is where the stamps themselves are born. Meet the carvers. They're not bakers. They don't rise before dawn to knead dough or argue over flour rations. Their hands are calloused, yes, but from scraping, etching, and engraving. You spot one of them now, hunched over a low bench, eyes squinting as he leans closer to a disc of clay no larger than a fig. He's carving backward Latin letters into the wet surface, one careful flick of a stylus at a time. It's slow work, painfully slow. If he messes up, the stamp will bake unevenly or smudge when pressed. Or worse, it will fail the inspector's gaze and be rejected altogether. weeks of trust building with the bakery down the drain. Stamp carvers were often freelancers, attached to no guild but indispensable to many. They traveled between neighborhoods, sometimes even cities, carrying their tools in little wooden cases. Inside, styluses of bronze and bone, sanded bits of shell for polishing, and maybe if the carver was particularly skilled, a stamp of their own, bearing just a tiny mark to say this one was mine. Some used soft clay that could be hardened in the oven alongside the bread. Others preferred wood, though it wore down faster and risked burning. A few risked carving into metal, which was durable but expensive. And every material had its quirks. Clay could warp in the kiln. Wood split in humid weather. Metal, well, it took the strength of an ox and the patience of a philosopher. You kneel beside the carver now, watching him reverse the letters V-I-B-I into a circle. It stands for Vibius, a local baker. The Is are easy. The B's, less so. They require curved pressure and a steady hand. You imagine the sound the finished stamp will make when pressed into dough thunk. A subtle, satisfying confirmation that someone's done their job. Historians still argue whether stamp design was standardized, or if bakers had creative freedom. Some surviving stamps are simple, just names. Others are more ornate, with borders, flourishes, or even symbols. One rare example shows a tiny fish, perhaps a nod to a seaside bakery, or maybe just a bored carver indulging himself. Another includes a date, which suggests loaves might have been batch-tracked across days. If so, Rome was logging data centuries before Excel made it fun. There's even fringe speculation that some stamps had hidden messages, like early graffiti, or inside jokes. One charred loaf from Pompeii, almost certainly stamped just before Vesuvius erupted, reads Sec fin divi s pistrin vs secundus the baker. Normal, right? But when studied closely, the lettering spacing is just off, too far apart. Some believe it's a code. For what? Nobody knows. Maybe Secundus was bored. Maybe he knew something. Or maybe most likely his stamp just broke and he was too tired to care. Back in the workshop, another carver is prepping a new commission. This one's a bit different. The stamp doesn't bear a name, it bears an abbreviation, PAPRAVG. That stands for Panis Privatus Augusti, Private Bread of the Emperor, a rare stamp reserved for palace kitchens and official ceremonies. These loaves would never be sold in the market or handed to a citizen. They might be placed as offerings at temples, served at elite banquets, or gifted in imperial audiences, and they still had to be stamped, because even the divine needs a label. Apparently, the carver begins his work, tongue poking slightly from the corner of his mouth as he leans in. You hear the soft scratch of the stylus. The room is otherwise silent, and you realize this is an art not of beauty, but of precision. The carver isn't trying to express himself. He's trying to communicate something clear, legal, and uniform. It's like being a typewriter before typewriters were a thing. A younger apprentice beside him is practicing too, working on a training disc with nonsense letters. His first attempt reads XYZZ, which is not very Roman, but excellent for practicing symmetry. He looks proud. His master glances over, says nothing, and nods once. That's as close as you get to praise in this workshop. One carver down the row uses a mirror. He glances at it repeatedly as he works, checking his backwards lettering to ensure it will appear correctly when baked into the loaf. It's a clever trick, but not new. The Romans had an uncanny grasp of visual logic. That's why their mosaics are so precise and their columns still stand. Bread stamps were just another form of orderly expression, dough as canvas, bureaucracy as brush. Sometimes, when an oven failed or the baker misfired a stamp, the stamp was to blame. Faulty impressions could mean fines, bad batches, even confiscation. So the carver's job carried pressure. Quiet pressure, the kind that clings to your shoulders and won't leave until the letters are perfect. You run your fingers lightly over a finished stamp left to dry. It's cool, slightly rough, the edges neatly smoothed. You imagine it pressed into wet dough, then into fire, then into history. So many stamps have survived burnt, buried, or preserved by sheer luck that archaeologists today can still read the names of bakers long forgotten. That's the strange magic of this whole world. Most of the people who shaped Roman history, senators, generals, Poets are gone in name only. Their fame outlived them. But these bakers, these stamp carvers, we know them because their names are quite literally baked into the past. A man named Celer, another named Rufus, a stamp carved by a man named Atticus, another by a woman named Flavia, yes. Women carved stamps too, especially in family businesses. Their mark survived because the bread hardened, the city burned, and time froze. You step back into the sunlight, feeling clay dust on your fingertips and the imprint of letters still warm in your mind. Rome may have conquered the world, but here in this little workshop, the real empire was in the details. Backwards letters, careful strokes, the quiet pride of someone who knew their job mattered not because it was grand, but because it made bread. Official, you leave the carvers behind, their little studio of silence and backwards letters, and follow the scent of something darker. Burnt crust and a hint of mischief. The alley opens onto another oven, smaller, half-shadowed, the bricks around it soot-stained and chipped. The baker here looks up sharply when he sees you. His loaves are stacked behind him, still warm, but one of them is suspiciously smooth on the bottom. No stamp. He catches your gaze, wipes his hands on his tunic, and mutters something about an accident with the mold. You don't need to press. You've found yourself at the heart of one of ancient Rome's most flower-dusted scandals, bread fraud. Yes, in an empire that fought wars, worshipped 100 gods, and built aqueducts that still confound engineers, people also schemed to fake bread stamps. Here's how it worked. The government provided free or subsidized grain to eligible citizens, often poor or jobless Romans, many of whom relied entirely on the state's generosity to survive. But eligibility had to be proved. Your name went on a list. Your household was counted. And when you received your grain, it was usually through a public bakery system. That meant your loaf, once baked, was stamped to track it back to your name. Your grain, your rightful portion. So, what if someone made extra loaves on the sly? What if a baker decided to bake 5 loaves, stamp 3, and quietly sell the other 2 under the counter? What if a citizen managed to obtain a stamp or forge one to claim someone else's ration? What if someone simply scrubbed off a stamp and repressed it with a fake? It happened. Historians still argue how widespread bread fraud really was. Some think it was rare, too risky, too easy to catch. Others argue it was rampant, especially during times of scarcity. After all, when grain shipments were delayed due to storms or piracy, and yes, grain pirates were a thing, people got hungry, and desperate people get creative. You run a hand along the rough stones of the oven's base, and find what looks like a makeshift press tucked into a corner. Not a proper stamp, just a flat chunk of wood with letters gouged in it by someone clearly in a rush. The lines are uneven, the spacing off, but in the half-light of a cooling bakery, it might pass. Forgery wasn't just a matter of carving a fake stamp. It also meant forging relationships, bribing inspectors, threatening apprentices, slipping an extra coin to the man counting loaves at the forum. And if you got caught, it depended. Minor fraud might mean a fine. Major fraud, like stealing grain outright or impersonating an official baker, could mean exile, or worse, and yet people risked it. Because bread was more than food. It was identity. It was ration. It was entitlement. You weren't just stealing a snack, you were manipulating a government benefit. You pass a wall where a faded announcement scroll flutters in the breeze. The ink is old but still legible. The baker. Gaius Fulvius is henceforth barred from the forum oven for the misrepresentation of 3 stamped loaves. No trial, just a public notice. Social humiliation, loss of access, and a long walk to a private oven if anyone would still serve him. And there were subtler frauds too. Some bakers reportedly reused old loaves slightly stale, but still edible by scraping off the bottoms and restamping them. Others created near-identical stamps to popular ones and passed off their goods as official. You know the type? A little after the name, just enough to fool the eye. One surviving stamp from a rural town reads Publi Panis, which simply means public bread. The stamp itself is crude, too crude. Scholars believe it was a forgery, someone trying to mimic the sanctioned stamps with little more than wishful carving. It's a bit like printing your own library card and hoping no one notices the crayon. There's even a fringe theory that some stamp forgers developed mobile setups, a wooden case with soft clay, a quick carve tool, and a small portable press. Bake, press, move, like ancient food trucks, but with more deception and fewer hashtags. As you move along, you encounter a disgruntled inspector. A woman in her 30s, eyes sharp, sandals worn thin. She's had a long day, 5 bakeries, dozens of loaves, and 3 questionable stamps. She lets you glance at her notes. One loaf bore a duplicate stamp from the wrong district. Another had an unfinished impression clearly done in haste, and the last was too smooth, no stamp at all, just the faintest smear of ash. A ghost stamp. She shrugs. They always try something, she mutters, especially before the festivals. That's another pattern. Stamp fraud increased before major public events. Saturnalia, Lupercalia. Imperial birthdays when demand for bread surged. More people, more loaves, more room for error and for exploitation. Even temples weren't immune. Loaves meant for ritual offerings were sometimes stolen and resold. Imagine showing up to make a sacred offering to Vesta and realizing your holy bread was half-bitten and bore someone else's name on the bottom. Scandalous, and definitely frowned upon. Of course, there were honest bakers too. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. People who followed the rules, got their stamps made properly, submitted reports, and still ended their days covered in sweat and flour. But it was the forgers, the frauds, the shady bread dealers, and back alleys that made regulation necessary. Which brings you full circle. Because in a system that tied food to identity and identity to law, even the smallest shortcut could ripple outward. One misstamped loaf might mean a hungry family. One fake stamp could mean stolen grain. And over time, those small frauds became history. You reach the end of the alley as the sky dims. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rings, marking the end of a baking shift. Another day's worth of bread stamped, inspected, and dispatched. And probably 1 or 2 loaves slipped past the rules. A smooth bottom here, a faked queue there. Ancient Rome may have built its glory on marble and iron, but it ran every single day on the rough, crusty honesty of stamped dough. The scent of roasted grain still lingers on your robe as you veer off the main street, drawn not by the bakeries or the shouting vendors this time, but by a gentle clang of bronze bells near a small temple courtyard. You pass under a low archway, and there it is. An offering table stacked with loaves. They're neatly arranged in concentric circles, each loaf bearing a crisp, unmistakable stamp. But unlike the ones you've seen before, these stamps don't name bakers or districts. These stamps are for gods. You're now in the realm of divine bread stamping. The Romans didn't just stamp bread for rationing, regulation, or ration tracking. They also stamped loaves that were never meant to be eaten. These were ritual offerings carefully baked, solemnly stamped, and presented at temples in what must have been the quietest, most meticulous segment of the bread bureaucracy. You kneel beside one of the loaves on the offering table. It's round, a little flatter than usual, dusted lightly with what might be sesame or even myrrh. Yes, the gods were allowed flavor. The stamp on this loaf reads PVL Cure Siri Ra, which means beautiful for Ceres, the Roman goddess of agriculture and grain. A devotional loaf, handcrafted, legally baked, and spiritually approved. Historians still argue whether these stamps were regulated like the public ones, or if temples designed their own. There's evidence on both sides. Some temples likely had approved stamp designs, perhaps created in cooperation with local officials. Others, especially in smaller towns, seem to have freelanced their offerings, homemade stamps with a kind of divine license. What mattered was the intent, and of course, the visibility of the name. The gods, too, it seems, appreciated paperwork. You notice another loaf, this one with a more obscure stamp, Favesto Iov, for favorable Jupiter. The design is more stylized, curved lettering, an arch motif, and what appears to be a little thunderbolt. It's adorable. In a way that bureaucracy usually isn't. There's a priest nearby, tending the offerings. He's middle-aged, quiet, with flour under his fingernails and a small brush for cleaning soot off stamps. He tells you that stamping divine loaves was about more than attribution. It was about intention. The stamped name declared not just who the bread was for, but why it was made. Was this a request? A thanks. A warning. Some loaves bore vague inscriptions like VOTVM solvit, a vow fulfilled. Others were more specific. Pro salve fili, for the safety of a son. These loaves were prayers made edible. The stamps, then, were not just labels. They were declarations of need and faith. There's a fringe theory, whispered in corners of academic journals, that certain temples had competitions over their bread stamps, that one priesthood tried to outdo another with more beautiful loaves, or longer inscriptions. Think Temple of Diana. Best decorative crust, 118 CE. It sounds absurd, but then again, humans have always found ways to compete. Even in holiness, you glance at a shrine to Vesta, goddess of the hearth. Her followers were obsessed with purity, both moral and culinary. Bread offerings here had to be spotless, unstained by soot, and the stamp had to be centered, not off-kilter, not cracked. The Vestals didn't accept sloppy divine carbs. You wonder how many bakers lost sleep over that. And this wasn't just a Roman thing. Provincial cities across the empire, from Gaul to Judea, adopted the practice in different ways. Some stamped their temple bread in Greek. Others used local symbols. There's a preserved loaf from a temple in northern Africa with a Berber sunburst design likely pressed with a carved stone. A little artistic flair between sacrifices. Not all temple loaves were burnt. Some were left out to decay. Others fed to animals or distributed to temple staff. But a few, particularly in rituals of renewal, were ceremonially destroyed, broken into pieces, tossed into sacred fires, or buried. And yet, even in destruction, the stamp mattered. It had to be seen, to be known. You reach for a small fragment of a loaf sitting beside a crumbling altar. It's hard as brick, the edges browned, but the stamp is still there. Veneri Libri, to Venus of women, likely an offering from a mother or a wife, praying for fertility or peace. The stamp is simple, a woman's name. Lucilla is pressed faintly below the main line. A trace of devotion, a whisper baked into crust. One scholar once described stamped divine bread as the paperwork of the soul. You kind of get it now. There's something hauntingly tender about a loaf meant not for a mouth, but for a presence, a god, a hope, and marked forever. So there's no doubt who it was for. Of course, not all divine stamps were so personal. During imperial festivals, especially those involving deified emperors, massive quantities of bread were baked, stamped, and offered en masse. Imagine hundreds of loaves reading Divs AVGVSTEs, Divine Augustus, piled in temple courtyards like carbohydrate propaganda. This is where religion and politics kneaded themselves together. If you were a local official trying to climb the ladder, commissioning a batch of lavishly stamped imperial loaves was a smart move. The gods noticed. So did the palace. Back in the courtyard, the priest gently lifts a stamped loaf from the offering table. He cradles it like something delicate. You watch as he carries it to a marble pedestal, places it down, and steps back. He says nothing. No chants, no fire. Just a quiet nod toward the heavens. And that's the thing. In all the noise of Rome, the forums, the parades, the bureaucrats, and the blustering, there were these soft, sacred moments. A single loaf, perfectly stamped. A whisper of reverence. A ritual no one tweeted about, but everyone somehow knew. You step away, leaving behind the divine carbs and the quiet priests. Outside, a child runs past carrying a half-eaten loaf, stamp still visible, Livia Pistrin vase, not for the gods, for lunch, but even that, in its own way, feels sacred. As you return to the urban sprawl, leaving behind temple courtyards and celestial carbs, the streets begin to narrow again. Not the grand avenues with marble colonnades and polished pavers, no. This is a working neighborhood. Laundry sways between wooden beams overhead. You step aside for a donkey cart stacked with dusty amphorae, and tucked behind a dilapidated row of insulae, those crowded Roman apartment blocks, is your next destination, a communal oven tucked deep in the shadow of peeling brick. This isn't one of these sleek, state-run facilities with proper logbooks and daily inspections. It's smaller, noisier, and slightly lopsided. It smells like burnt crust and ambition. Welcome to the semi-legal underbelly of Roman baking. This is where baking behind the insulae happened. You slip inside and are immediately met with the heat of the hearth and the squabble of too many voices in too little space. There's no clear line between private and public baking here. A dozen families share access. Each brings their own dough, their own pan, and, most crucially, their own bread stamp. Because even in these back alley ovens, loaves must bear names, if not for legality, then at least for ownership. Otherwise, it's a carbohydrate free-for-all. You watch as a girl not older than 12 presses her family's homemade stamp into a lump of dough. It's carved into a bit of olive wood, worn soft from years of use. The letters are simple: Main Mar, Minutia Marcia, the matriarch, the owner of both stamp and dough. Everyone around her is doing the same. It's a hive of flour-dusted efficiency. Someone fumbles a stamp and curses. Another argues that their loaf has been swapped. You note that the oven's operator, the unofficial master of ceremonies, keeps a mental tally of which loaves go where. His eyes flick to every stamp, every movement. He's part baker, part referee, part peacekeeper. These ovens flourished, no pun intended, in working-class neighborhoods. You didn't need permission to use them, though technically, some districts had posted limits on heat usage and baking hours. Of course, those rules were often interpreted creatively. Historians still argue whether these communal spaces were quietly tolerated by officials or simply ignored. Some suggest the state turned a blind eye so long as the loaves bore stamps and the neighbors didn't riot. Others believe periodic crackdowns happened, especially when flour shortages made tempers rise faster than dough in a summer kitchen. And yet, this is where Rome really lived. Not in temples or official bakeries, but in these low-ceilinged courtyards. No marble, no scrolls, just clay stamps passed down through generations, and an unspoken agreement that everyone gets their turn. One man shows you his family stamp. It's ancient, the lettering nearly rubbed away, the edges smoothed from hundreds of uses. He says his great-grandfather carved it during the reign of Trajan. He's probably embellishing, but the pride in his voice is unmistakable. Some loaves in these spaces aren't just marked with names, they're decorated too. A few bear tiny geometric patterns around the stamp. One has a faint vine design curling beside the letters. These aren't officially sanctioned. They're personal flair, community aesthetics, or just a way to keep the kids entertained while the oven heats. You pass a woman holding a batch of flat loaves. She's carved her stamp into a bit of terracotta roof tile, reusing what she could find. Resourcefulness, baked into every crust. You ask how she keeps the letter straight. She shrugs and says, "I know which ones are mine." The oven knows too. A comforting kind of logic. There's something beautifully human about this chaos. No inspectors hover nearby. No perfectus waiting to review ledgers. Just people, stamps, and heat. But that doesn't mean there's no order. One woman acts as an informal scribe, logging whose loaves are in. And when they go out, she does it in charcoal, on the wall. It's not pretty, but it works. Names, tally marks, a system built out of need and repetition. There's even a kind of honor code about loaf removal. You don't touch someone else's bread. You wait, you watch, and you use your stamp to claim what's yours when it's done. It's rudimentary, but it works. A fringe theory among archaeologists claims that some of these oven spaces evolved into informal neighborhood courts, disputes settled beside the hearth, stamp confusion as legal precedent. If true, it's the coziest courtroom in history. You pause now, crouching beside the glowing oven mouth. The coals hum like bees. Inside, the loaves rise. They shift and settle. And on the bottom of each, a stamp slowly forms, pressed earlier by floury fingers, now set forever in heat. Some of these loaves will be eaten by nightfall. Others will be traded, bartered for olive oil, lentils, maybe a handful of dried figs, and one or two might be set aside, hardened, and kept as mementos. Not because of flavor, because of meaning. A loaf from a wedding, a birthday, a son's return from the army, memories, pressed in crust. You sit back as the woman with the charcoal nods. Time's up. Loaves come out. A flurry of hands and voices, brief chaos, then calm. Everyone gets their stamp back. Everyone leaves with bread. No scrolls, no marble tablets, just a satisfied neighborhood. It's easy to forget how much of Rome functioned this way. Beneath the pomp, behind the law, in quiet, smoky courtyards where people stamped their names into flour and hoped no one swapped their loaf while they weren't looking. The sun has started to slip toward the rooftops, casting long orange beams through the narrow streets as you wander from the smoky communal ovens. You round a corner and find yourself outside a domus, the kind of private residence that screams modest wealth. Not lavish, not poor, just comfortable enough to have its own kitchen and, apparently, its own bread inspector. You didn't expect to meet one today, but here she is, slim, grim, with a basket of tools slung over her shoulder like some ancient combination of IRS agent and food critic. You follow her for a moment, quietly curious. She doesn't knock at the door of the house. She walks past it. She's not there for an audit. She's doing her rounds. Meet the bread inspector, or, more precisely, one of many junior inspectors under the umbrella of the Cura Annoni. Their job, verify that stamped loaves were legit, that grain distribution wasn't being misused, and that no one was gaming the system by baking mystery bread in a corner oven and passing it off as state-issued. You trail her through the Suburra, Rome's busiest working-class district, where the smells are loud, the gossip is louder, and the bread flows like currency. Her first stop is a small stall selling yesterday's loaves. She picks one up, sniffs it. No, really, flips it over, and examines the stamp. Her stylist jots a note on a wax tablet. Stamp worn. Possible reuse. She's not a baker. She's not an official. She's something in between, trained just enough to identify legitimate stamps and empowered just enough to fine you for faking one. Her badge, a tiny bronze token clipped to her belt, marked with the imperial eagle and the word Annona. Historians still argue whether inspectors like her worked alone or in teams. Some sources suggest they paired off, one to check loaves, another to log violations. Others believe they roamed solo, like sleepy detectives in linen tunics, sniffing out subpar stamp jobs before lunchtime. One quirky tidbit. A fragmentary scroll from the reign of Hadrian details a disagreement between two inspectors over whether a loaves stamp said PAVLVS or PEVS. The dispute escalated. There was yelling. Eventually, a third inspector was called in. The loaf had to be broken apart to settle the matter. No word on who was right, but the idea that Roman officials once held a crust-based tribunal is deeply comforting. Back on the street, your inspector moves with quiet certainty. She checks another cart. 3 loaves. 2 stamped. 1 suspiciously blank. She raises an eyebrow. The baker swears it fell on ash and lost the mark. She's heard it before. She notes it, nods once, and keeps walking. No finis today, just a warning. Bread inspections weren't just about stamping errors. They also covered weight. Roman loaves had to meet specific size requirements too small, and it counted as short-changing. Too large, and people suspected it was made with extra grain, possibly stolen. That meant your humble inspector carried more than a stylus. She had a standard weight loaf with her, not edible. Just for comparison, a kind of crusty golden standard. If you will, you glance inside her basket. Sure enough, there it is, hardened, dark, unmistakably ancient. She plucks a fresh loaf from a vendor's stack, balances it briefly against her reference, and squints. Satisfied, she moves on. Some days, she inspects as many as 100 loaves. Other days, she spends hours interrogating one bakery on festival eves. Chaos. She once reportedly chased a man through 4 blocks after spotting a re-stamped loaf tucked under his cloak. He tripped, dropped it, and the stamp split in half. Instant confession. There's a strange satisfaction in watching her work. Quiet, deliberate, and oddly intimate, like a sommelier who cares deeply about bottom crust textures and flour distribution. You ask her softly how she learned to spot fakes. She shrugs. Experience. Real stamps have personality. Fakes try too hard. And then she tells you something you weren't expecting. She once kept a diary of the most beautiful stamps she saw. She'd draw them at night, tiny flourishes, clever spacing, even ones that included little wheat stalks or stars. It was her hobby. A way to make sense of the endless parade of dough and fraud. She lost the diary during a fire in the Aventine. Sometimes she tries to remember them loaf by loaf. You continue walking beside her until she stops in front of a modest bakery, a family operation with 3 generations bustling behind the counter. The patriarch emerges with a steaming batch, each loaf proudly flipped to show its stamp. Familia tertia. She inspects one, smiles faintly, and gives him a thumbs up. Well, the Roman equivalent. You notice how even in this heavily regulated system, there's room for ritual, pride, and affection. The inspectors weren't always enforcers. Sometimes they were protectors, guardians of fairness in a world where a few extra ounces of wheat could mean the difference between dinner and empty hands. A fringe theory posits that inspectors sometimes took bribes in bread rather than coin. One archaeologist found a letter fragment reading, "Give her the olive loaf. She favors it, and she'll look the other way on the third." Whether true or not, it's delicious to imagine. You and the inspector part ways near a wine stall, where she buys herself a cheap cup and settles on a stone bench. She doesn't look tired, just observant, like someone who knows that Rome doesn't run on emperors or legions. It runs on crust, on stamps, on accountability. As you walk away, you glance back one last time. She's pulled a fresh loaf from her bag, turned it over, and studied the stamp. You think she might be smiling. The streets wind upward now as you climb toward the outskirts of the city beyond the din of markets, the echo of temple bells, and the warm tang of street ovens. The air cools slightly, trees thin out, and in the distance, you hear a different rhythm entirely. Marching boots, shouted Latin, the occasional clang of armor. You're nearing a Roman military outpost, not a battlefield, more of a garrison, a place where bread isn't just food or faith. Here, bread is identity. You step into the barracks compound, where leather tents, timber walls, and orderly rows of stone cookhouses define the world. The legionnaires are at rest now. Some polishing weapons, others writing letters or dicing for coins. And on a flat stone table in the center of the square sits a basket of loaves, each one as dense and round as a curled fist. But more importantly, each bears a clear, unmistakable stamp. These are military bread stamps, and they're as utilitarian as a soldier's belt. One loaf reads Leg ex gem for Legio ex Gemina, the 10th twin legion. Another bears COH2 cent AEL, shorthand for cohort 2, century of alias, not decorative, not subtle, just big, blocky Latin, pressed deep into the crust so it won't flake away on a long march. Because Roman soldiers didn't carry ID cards, they carried loaves. Bread was rationed by unit. Each day, grain was distributed, milled, baked in centralized ovens, and handed out to avoid mix-ups. Loaves were stamped with the relevant legion and cohort, sometimes even with the camp location. If a soldier deserted, if a ration was stolen, if a fight broke out over missing food, those stamps told the story. Historians still argue whether soldiers stamped the loaves themselves or if the military kitchens had assigned stampers. Some suggest each centurion had a designated bread orderly with a box of stamps. Others believe stamps were standardized and passed between units like supply tags. Either way, the system worked. You pause at a baking station where a soldier in his 30s, arms like marble columns, is pressing a bronze stamp into a tray of flattened dough. The stamp handle is worn, darkened by fire and grip. The letters, leg 3, Phila, 4th Flavian Legion. He doesn't look up as he works, he just grunts, presses, flips, and lines the stamped rounds on a paddle. There's a ritual here, not holy, but sacred in its own way, because for soldiers, bread meant continuity. No matter where you were stationed, Britannia, Syria, the Rhine, you ate roughly the same loaf. Dense, dry, reliable, and always marked. One quirky tidbit. Some soldiers kept their stamped bread in waxed linen bags, carefully folded to preserve the imprint, not for sentiment, for record-keeping. If a ration dispute broke out, a well-preserved stamp could exonerate you. No, sir, I didn't eat twice. See, this one's from yesterday. Bureaucracy, even in a tent. A particularly well-preserved find in Vindolanda, near Hadrian's Wall, showed that some soldiers even carved tiny marks beside the official stamp personal signs. A star, a cross, a scratch like a lightning bolt. Was it flair? Identification. A tiny joke. Nobody knows, but it means someone, somewhere, cared enough to personalize their regulation bread. And of course, bread wasn't just eaten, it was traded, shared, bartered. A stamped military loaf could be used as payment for a favor, a secret, or a flask of watered-down wine, which meant forgery existed here too. You glance over at a young soldier flipping loaves near the fire. One of his looks off. The stamp reads COH Vate, but the lettering slants slightly, and the crust over it is uneven. You raise an eyebrow. He notices, shrugs. Bad day. He mutters, you leave it at that. But now you know bread fraud didn't end at the city gates. There's an amusing theory floating around that the infamous Varus disaster, where 3 Roman legions were lost in the Germanic forests, was preceded by grain shortages and poor bread. No hard evidence, just whispered speculation. But it fits the Roman worldview. Empires fall not with swords, but with soggy loaves. In quieter moments, you find a cluster of soldiers lounging with bread and olives, the stamped loaves resting on their knees. One man older, clearly a veteran, uses a knife to carefully carve around the stamp, lifting it from the crust like a badge. He tucks it into a leather pouch. For my boy, he says, so he knows where I've been. You nod and say nothing. The moment speaks loud enough. Even in retirement, some veterans kept their old stamps. There are records, mostly gravestones, that depict loaves or stamp motifs beside the name. A way of saying, I served. I earned my crust. Back in the camp kitchen, the stamp man finishes his batch. He wipes his stamp clean, taps it once on the stone counter, and places it carefully in a wooden box lined with cloth. You ask him if he's ever lost one. Once, he says. Took me a week to carve a new one. The centurion made me re-stamp every loaf I'd baked that day. Over the fire, burning fingers and all. He grins. But it's the grin of someone who will never let that happen again. As you leave the camp, the sun now dipping low over the hills, a trumpet call signals evening rations. Soldiers line up. Bread is distributed. Loaves flipped. Stamps checked. Portions measured. In a world of swords and shields, it's the crust that holds order. And so, another day ends, one more cycle of baking, stamping, and eating. Bread, still warm from the oven, still bearing its official imprint, disappears into the hands of men who may never see Rome again, but who carry it with them, stamped on every bite. You leave the garrison behind, its campfires flickering in the dusk, and descend toward the city once more, but not toward the ovens this time. No flour-dusted courtyards or steaming bakeries. You're headed to a quieter place, a place where bread wasn't consumed for nutrition or spirit, but leveraged for politics. Yes, tonight, you arrive at the edge of the Aventine Hill, where a crowd has gathered near the portico of a wealthy villa. But this isn't a riot or festival, it's a birthday party. Specifically, an imperial birthday celebration. And among the amphorae of wine, strings of laurel leaves, and platters of fruit, there's something else piled high on a silver tray, loaves of bread, each stamped with those words, Nat Diva Favstina, Happy Birthday, Divine Faustina. These are propaganda loaves bred with a message. Not advertising, not compliance, just pure, edible influence. Stamped bread became a form of political messaging in the later Roman Empire, especially as emperors began to associate their images, mottos, and cults with everyday goods. Coins bore faces and slogans, but bread reached everyone, from senators to street vendors. And so, stamping loaves became a clever, carb-loaded way to spread ideas, loyalty, and the illusion of divine favor. You lift one of the loaves from the tray. The stamp is crisp. Concordia avi vistor vm, harmony of the emperors. A slogan repeated in marble and mosaic, now pressed lovingly into dough. The crust glistens slightly with olive oil, and the crowd eagerly snatches them up. It's not just bread, it's branding. Historians still argue whether these propaganda stamps were mandated by the state or generated by overachieving provincial governors trying to win favor. One theory suggests imperial bakeries were required to use themed stamps on feast days. Another holds that it was mostly voluntary, encouraged but not enforced. There's even a surviving clay stamp bearing Salves Agi IPV Blight Alia, Health of the Republic, which raises the question, was that loaf medicinal or just wishful thinking? One fringe tidbit. A set of loaves found in a rubbish heap near the Palatine bore the stamp Pax et Panis Peace and Bread. It's the Roman version of a campaign slogan, possibly linked to an election for Tribunus Plebis. The People's Tribune. Yes, even local politicians had their carbs campaign ready. You move through the gathering as people break their loaves apart, some laughing, some nodding respectfully. An older woman wraps half a stamped loaf in cloth. She says she'll save it, maybe even keep the crust for luck. A young man tries to scrape the stamp off his to keep as a souvenir. No one seems to mind. It wasn't only emperors who used this trick. Noble families did too. One preserved loaf in the ruins of Herculaneum reads, Domitia Gretia, likely meaning by the favor of Domitia, an elite matron sharing her wealth and reminding everyone exactly where their free bread came from. Roman philanthropy came with lettering. Even temples got in on the act. During major religious festivals, stamped loaves reading Iovi Optimo Maximo to Jupiter best and greatest would be distributed in temples, public spaces, and forums. Some were meant as offerings, yes, but many were for people, free bread with a side of theological messaging. And that's what makes it so fascinating. Stamped bread began as a practical tool, an ID tag for baked goods. But Rome, being Rome, couldn't leave it at that. It had to become symbolic, performative. And when emperors realized that hungry citizens made good audiences, bread became their stage. One archaeologist suggested that some stamps were designed to mimic coin iconography. Same slogans, same motifs, just, well, flakier. You imagine someone holding a denarius in one hand and a stamped loaf in the other, nodding slowly and thinking, consistent branding. Nice touch, Hadrian. You pass a group of children handing out festival loaves bearing Annona Evgepsti, the emperor's grain supply. This wasn't just bread. It was a subtle reminder that Rome's stomach was full thanks to imperial logistics. Or, more accurately, that you were expected to believe that. And in the provinces, the provinces embraced the trend with a flair. In Gaul, loaves were found bearing Victoria Romana, Roman victory. In Egypt, a Greek inscription reading Theos Sebastos, God Augustus, was stamped into barley bread. Even in far-off Britannia, fragments of wheat loaves bore the imperial monogram, likely distributed to soldiers and citizens during imperial visits or decrees. There's a theory that some bakers kept two stamps, one standard, one decorative. On regular days, you used your name, but on imperial holidays, you pulled out the fancy one. Like switching from your everyday tunic to your festival toga. You stop beside a merchant who is slicing a stamped loaf into tiny pieces and placing each one on a platter with bits of cheese and dates. He offers you a bite. You accept. The crust is chewy, the crumb dry, but the message is loud and clear. Felicitas sai ekveli. Prosperity of the age. You chew thoughtfully. Hard to disagree. Really, at least tonight. And yet, some people resisted, whispered complaints that the slogans were hollow, that the emperors who gave bread also raised taxes, that stamped loaves with smiling messages didn't erase the smoky bitterness of corruption. But in Rome, you didn't say that out loud, you just ate the bread. As the party begins to dim, and the crowd thins out, you see an elderly man carefully wrapping a loaf and placing it into a small wooden box. He says it was baked the day of Marcus Aurelius's accession. He's kept it all these years, a memento of quiet propaganda, carved not into stone, but into crust. You walk away under the lantern glow, hands dusted with flour, thoughts filled with edible slogans. In Rome, nothing was neutral, not law, not leisure, and certainly not loaves. If it could be stamped, it could be spun. And so every bite was a message, every crust, a campaign. You find yourself far from the marble arches of the capital now. The terrain grows rougher, villas give way to vineyards. Chickens cross your path with no sense of urgency. You're in the provinces, those sprawling territories that made up the Roman Empire's outer lungs. They inhaled Rome's orders and exhaled grains, oil, taxes, and soldiers, and, naturally, bread. You duck into a small town near the coast of Hispania. The sun bakes the clay rooftops. A few boys kick a rag-stuffed ball past a shrine to Minerva. Somewhere, a dog is barking at a donkey. But your destination isn't the tavern or the market. It's a tiny bakery pressed between two houses. Its oven is cracked, its tiles mismatched, and the smell coming out is nothing short of heavenly. Inside, you find provincial bakers, sweating and cheerful, pulling round loaves from the hearth. These aren't quite like the ones in Rome. They're rougher, more rustic. Some look half-burnt, others oddly shaped. But they all have one thing in common. Stamps, sort of. You pick up a loaf from the basket and examine the bottom. There's a mark. Yes, but it's more of a smudge than a clear stamp. Two crooked letters. LC. The baker shrugs. Lucius Cornelius. He says, wiping his hands, my cousin carved it into a bone. I stamped before sunrise. No time to be perfect. Here, you've entered the world of local stamp drama where the rules of the capital don't quite stretch, and the results are interpretive. Historians still argue how tightly provincial bakers were expected to follow the Annona rules. In some cities, especially those near Rome or important trade ports, inspectors and officials kept close watch. But in quieter towns, the system bent. Sometimes it snapped entirely. One quirky example comes from Gaul, where a loaf was discovered with a stamp that simply read BIB. Scholars debated for years. Was it short for a baker's name? A religious abbreviation? A joke? Eventually, someone proposed the winning theory. It was an abbreviation for bibendum to drink. That loaf had likely been baked in a tavern. You can't make this stuff up. Even the materials used for stamps varied wildly out here. In Rome, it was usually clay or bronze. But here, wood, bone, charcoal rubbed rocks. One baker in Numidia reportedly stamped his loaves with a flat seashell pressed into the dough. The pattern wasn't readable, but it was distinct. Customers knew his bread by feel, not text. Some provincial bakers used symbolic stamps instead of names. A fish, a wheel, a star. Maybe because they were illiterate. Maybe because symbols worked better in a multilingual marketplace. Or maybe it just looked cooler. You bite into a piece of barley bread dense, chewy, and surprisingly sour. The baker tells you he uses wild yeast from the olive groves. No one regulates that. But if someone complained about the stamp, they can go cry to the governor. He laughs. By the time he gets here, the bread's already eaten. There's a bit of swagger here. A freedom born from distance. Rome's rules are known. Sure, but they're adapted, stretched. You ask about inspectors. The baker snorts. Last one came 4 summers ago. Asked me what my stamp meant. I said it was private. He left. Some scholars believe this tension between central order and local practice was part of the empire's genius. Flexibility beneath the appearance of uniformity. As long as the bread kept coming, no one panicked over a crooked C. That said, stamp conflicts did happen. In a town near Alexandria, an argument erupted when 2 bakeries began using the same stamp Sethos. Whether it was a name or a claim to divine favor isn't clear. But what is clear is that a small bread war broke out. Each accused the other of theft. Stamps were hurled. Loaves were confiscated. It ended when the local temple intervened and assigned new stamps to both Seth A and Seth B. Truly the most passive-aggressive resolution in bread history. You wander now through a market in Dalmatia, where a merchant sells blessed loaves with tiny crosses stamped into the crust. Christian influence. Maybe, or just marketing. He claims the loaves stay fresh longer. A skeptical passerby mutters, they're just drier. Still, the stamp glows faintly gold in the morning light. One theory even suggests some provincial communities stamped loaves after baking, using heated metal to burn a mark into the crust. Risky, messy, but very dramatic. You imagine someone branding a fresh loaf like cattle, sizzle, justice. You pass a small stall selling day-old loaves for animal feed. One of them bears no stamp at all. The seller says it was a mistake, or maybe it's counterfeit. Hard to say. You turn it over, half expecting it to say oops in Latin. In some provinces, the stamp was never about regulation. It was about tradition. A village might use the same family stamp for generations, even if no officials ever checked it. Not for bureaucracy. For pride. You meet an old woman in a coastal village in Crete. She bakes once a week, still using the wooden stamp her grandmother carved. It's worn down, the letters barely visible. Evidokia. She stamps every loaf with care, then tucks the stamp away in a box beside a faded oil lamp. No one checks anymore, she says, but I do it anyway. It's mine. And that's the heart of it. Far from the marble of Rome, the bureaucracy softens, the rules blur, but the stamps remain. Faint, crooked, sometimes unintelligible, but real, pressed into dough, carried on crust, remembered by generations. You look back once more at the bakery door, smoke curls lazily from the chimney. The oven mouth glows faintly red. A fresh loaf is pulled free, flipped, and marked with a wonky little fish. Not legal, not perfect, but unmistakably, proudly stamped. You're back in Rome now, seated in the dusty corner of a private library tucked inside a crumbling domus, once owned by a minor senator who, judging by the state of things, cared far more for scrolls than status. Piles of papyrus rest beside cracked amphorae, and a faded mosaic of a she-wolf watches silently from the far wall. There's no fire lit, just the cool hush of forgotten things. And on the table before you, a small wooden box lined with linen and packed with treasure. Not gold, not coins, stamps. Clay stamps, bronze ones, wooden fragments with backward lettering, dozens of them, lovingly stored, some with labels written in an impossibly tight Latin hand. This was the life's work of a man named Titus Claudius Carbo, a bureaucrat turned obsessive. And your glimpse into the lost art of stamp cataloging. The Roman world didn't just make stamped bread. It kept records of the stamps themselves, some for legal purposes, some for pride, and some for the same reason people today collect bottle caps or vintage typewriters, because they couldn't help themselves. You lift one stamp from the box, it's pale terracotta, barely the size of a coin. The letters read Q Fabi Dom, short for Quintus Fabius Domitianus. There's a chip on the edge, but the carving is so precise you could still bake with it. Claudius Carbo has included a little parchment slip, recovered from Subura Bakery. Fire 9th year of Marcus Aurelius. The note is more poetic than official. You can almost hear the reverence in the ink. Historians still argue how widespread stamp documentation was. Some believe the government kept copies of each issued stamp mold, like little carb-laden fingerprints. Others think it was left to bakers themselves, who guarded their stamps with the same seriousness as temple relics. But people like Carbo, they cataloged for love. His surviving writings, barely pieced together from wax tablets and scattered scrolls, describe a system. He divided stamps by shape, material, and style. He made little ink rubbings of each, pressing them into soft clay, then painting over them and transcribing the impressions onto vellum. You find one rubbing that looks almost modern, a grid layout. Tidy rows, tiny notes in the margins likely from Aventine quarter. Based on curvature or defect in third letter suggests haste. Carbo wasn't just listing stamps. He was decoding them, reading them like secret messages baked into daily life. One fringe theory claims that Carbo believed bread stamps held cultural patterns, that by analyzing how names were abbreviated or how symbols were spaced, one could trace migrations, economic shifts, even political sentiment. It's wildly speculative but compelling. You imagine him bent over a candle, squinting at two nearly identical stamps and whispering, "This one's Nervan, that one's Trajan. The V is tighter." He wasn't alone. In later centuries, antiquarians attempted to recreate this work. A 5th century scholar named Felix of Ephesus reportedly gathered over 200 different bread stamp rubbings into a single codex, most now lost. One fragment remains in a monastery in Calabria. It shows a detailed drawing of a stamp reading Elvecriti Panis, the loaf, long gone. But the record, still legible. You turn another page and find something even stranger, a copy of a military bread stamp, drawn beside a side profile of a legionnaire's helmet. Carbo's note reads, "Found near camp of Legio Iberican, Gemina loaf, hardened like stone. Stamp flawless. Could serve as seal if cut properly. Yes, he considered using it as a seal, because at some point, stamps crossed over from utility into symbolism. They weren't just tools, they were history, identity, memory. There's a charcoal sketch of a stamp with the odd inscription, ex anima, which means from the soul. It's not official, not even legal, possibly a private baker's joke. Carbo writes, unknown source, perhaps a statement of love or of defiance. You wonder how many such stamps were lost, buried in ash, crumbled under hooves, eaten entirely, not the bread. Of course, the bread was eaten. But the stamp impressions, ephemeral, temporary, forgotten with the last bite. Which is why Carbo's box matters, because it tried to catch what would otherwise disappear. You find a list of stamps arranged by emotion, not type, not origin emotion. Carbo labeled them pride, fear, devotion, play, under pride. He includes elaborate bakery marks with full family names and double borders, under fear. Just the word annone, deeply pressed. Perhaps a reminder of the inspector's gaze. Under devotion, temple offerings, under play, a loaf stamped with a crude drawing of a donkey. Not everything survives. Rats have chewed the corners of the box. A few stamps are broken, their names lost forever, but the essence remains. One final parchment, rolled and fragile, holds Carbo's own musings. I have touched more stamps than I have people, yet in each one, I see the hand that pressed it. I know nothing of the baker's life, but I know they paused for a breath before the impression. That pause is the closest I get to their world. You sit with that for a moment. The idea that the briefest press of clay or bronze into dough could echo through centuries, not because the bread was special, but because someone thought it mattered enough to mark. You place the stamp back in its linen nest. You roll the parchment closed. Outside, life goes on. Loaves are rising. Ovens are stoked. But here, in the quiet heart of forgotten cataloging, the stamps speak still. The streets of Pompeii are eerily quiet now, not because the town is asleep, but because it's gone buried, frozen, and cracked open centuries later like a sealed jar of honey with dust inside. You're walking through the ghost of a bakery, its oven mouth still blackened, its counters half collapsed, the walls whisper of normalcy interrupted, and there, in the corner, you see them. Loaves, real, charred, ash-preserved loaves, still round, still stamped. You're standing inside one of Pompeii's most famous pistrina, a commercial bakery, complete with grinding stones, kneading benches, and the quiet remains of a workday that never ended. Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, covering the city in pumice and ash, so suddenly that even bread was caught mid-rise. But not just any bread. These loaves brittle, blackened, but unmistakable bear clear bread stamps. The most famous reads, Sealer S.L. Serg. 2 names, abbreviated. Seller, a slave servus who baked the loaf. Sergius, his owner. A crumb-sized bureaucratic statement burned into immortality. Historians still argue whether this particular stamp meant the loaf was for Sergius personally or simply baked under his name. Some believe it was destined for market, others that it was part of a temple offering. The truth is lost under layers of volcanic debris, but the stamp remains. You lean closer. The loaf has hardened like stone, the ridges crisp, the stamp deep and deliberate. This wasn't accidental. Someone pressed it, with a steady hand and likely a sigh, sometime early that morning, unaware that the volcano looming nearby was already coughing smoke. There's a fringe theory that a second loaf, found in a different oven, bears a hidden message. Its stamp, Resti ITVTA, could mean restored or be the name of a freed woman baker. Some believe it was part of a batch to celebrate her manumission. Others think it was just a brand. Either way, it's one of the few loaves in Pompeii not associated with enslavement. A rare bit of autonomy, fossilized. And it wasn't just one bakery. 25 bakeries have been identified in Pompeii alone. Most had fixed ovens, flour storage, and workstations, and nearly all show evidence of stamping tools, molds, or loaves themselves. The whole city buzzed with the rhythm of baking. Some neighborhoods had their own specialties. A bakery near the amphitheater reportedly made sweeter loaves with added musk grape syrup. Another near the Temple of Isis focused on sacrificial bread. One loave's stamp reads Panis Sylvan Vis, likely referencing the rustic god of woods and boundaries. Was it divine tribute? A branding decision? A joke? Maybe all three. Sylvanus had a sense of humor. You find a half-buried counter with shallow depressions in the stone. Not cups, not oil pots, but tiny molds, probably used for pre-stamping dough before it went into the oven. There's even soot where the stampers likely sat pressed into service, over and over. In the days leading up to oblivion, what's haunting is how mundane it all is. You find a loaf still in a basket, stamped, untouched, sitting there for nearly 2,000 years as the world collapsed around it. Archaeologists believe it was meant for delivery. A slave probably stepped out to fetch a jar or a receipt, then never came back. The loaf waited. Another was found in what was once a dining room. The table collapsed, the ceiling gone, but the loaf endured. Whoever stamped it didn't live to explain what it meant. They didn't need to. The stamp speaks on their behalf. Elvi Crao ix officina, Lucerius, from the workshop. One stamp even appears to make a joke. The letters are all reversed, so when stamped into the dough, they came out backwards. A mistake or an ancient prank. Scholars are divided. Some call it the oldest known bakery misprint. Others think it was intentional, perhaps to mark a batch meant to be discarded or fed to animals. There's beauty in this chaos, a city overwhelmed, but its crusts preserved. Bread was no longer a living thing, but it remained. Modern archaeologists treat these loaves with reverence. They've been X-rayed, scanned, even recreated by food historians who try to mimic their recipes. Flour, water, salt, wild yeast, and a long, slow ferment, and always a stamp. One culinary historian made replicas of the C. Eller loaf. He stamped it lovingly, then left it out overnight and cried when the cat sat on it. You smile at that. Even now, people try to reconnect through crust and clay. In the Naples Museum, these loaves sit behind glass, guarded like relics. People lean close, noses nearly pressed to the display, not just to marvel at their preservation, but to read the stamps. That's the hook. They don't say much. A name, a hint of ownership, but it's enough. Because the person who stamped that bread is gone. Their family's gone. Even the city they lived in is mostly rubble and mosaic dust. But the stamp pressed into dough, baked in fire, frozen by ash remains. A whisper, a trace, a punchline. A proof, back outside, the sun begins to dip behind what remains of Vesuvius. You pause at the gate to the city. One last glance at the bakery. Its loaves fossilized mid-shift, its stamps still legible. The ovens have cooled for centuries, but the crust remembers. You've left behind Pompeii's ashes and returned to the present, but only barely. You're standing now inside a clean, quiet test kitchen tucked inside a Roman archaeology institute. The walls are lined with flour sacks and temperature-controlled ovens, and a stainless steel table gleams under the lights. You're here to witness something few people attempt with seriousness: recreating ancient Roman bread stamps. At the center of it all is a food historian named Julia, dressed in a crisp apron, her hands already dusted with spelt flour. She's been baking like it's 75 CE for years now, and today she's going for authenticity. No modern yeast, no shortcuts, just patience, tools, and a table full of replica bread stamps based on archaeological finds. Some are faithful reproductions of real stamps from Pompeii, Ostia, and Herculaneum. Others are speculative, crafted based on partial rubbings, fragments, and educated guesswork. One stamp reads Celer SL Surg. Of course. Another reads Ex off Anne, taken from a clay shard found in Gaul. And then there's a fun one, shaped like a crescent, bearing just the word Fort Vienna. She says that one's not based on any official find. Just a what if she couldn't resist. Julia presses a clay stamp into a round loaf and winces. Too deep. The dough buckles. She sighs. That's attempt number 37 this week. The goal isn't just to get the letters visible, it's to replicate the feel, the pressure, the process. Because modern replication of Roman bread is an art and a science, you can follow the ancient recipe all you want. Spelt or emmer flour, water, maybe a splash of olive oil. But the moment you start stamping, you hit challenges. Dough elasticity, moisture content, stamp surface, all of it matters. Too wet, and the letters dissolve. Too dry, and the stamp cracks the dough open like a fault line. Historians still argue whether Roman bakers stamped the dough before the second proof or just before baking. Some replicas hold shape better if stamped after shaping. Others swell unpredictably and swallow the letters entirely. It's a 2,000-year-old baking mystery. Half the fun. Apparently, you watch her switch to a wooden stamp, this time lightweight, with gently rounded letters. She presses more carefully. This time, it holds. Elvisius Panis. She beams like someone who's just deciphered a forgotten language. One fringe group in the experimental archaeology community actually makes their own stamps using traditional methods, clay shaped by hand, dried in the sun, fired in wood-burning kilns. They insist on using tools that could plausibly have existed in antiquity. One man even built a miniature Roman bakery in his backyard, complete with a dome oven and a stray cat he named Vespasian. Their online message board is a delightful chaos of debates over flour ratios, firewood types, and whether it's acceptable to bake on a Tuesday when Mars is retrograde. Julia is a bit more flexible. She uses a gas oven. "I'm after the textures of the past," she says, "not its blisters." And here's where it gets even more peculiar. Some of the replica stamps being used today were made using 3D scans of surviving ancient artifacts. Museums quietly lend access to researchers who then print replicas with high-resolution resin printers. The result? A perfect, press-ready ancient stamp, accurate down to the chipped corner and worn serif. One loaf Julia pulls from the oven is a replica of a Pompeian soldier's bread, based on a fragment recovered near the barracks. It bears the letters Leg 15 Apol, the 15th Apollinaris Legion. The crust is cracked, slightly overbaked, but the stamp, perfect. You run your fingers along it, raised just enough to feel a bite of military history. She also tries a double stamp, one with the baker's name, one with the customer's. It's ambitious, and Roman law might not have required it. But some evidence suggests dual stamping existed, especially in wealthier neighborhoods or for temple loaves. It's basically the ancient version of signing both the check and the receipt. You ask her what the hardest part is. She doesn't hesitate. Getting the stamp to speak without shouting. When pressed too hard, the stamp tears the dough. Too soft, and the impression vanishes in the oven. It's like trying to whisper in hot clay. There's something strangely moving about watching this process. The careful mixing, the patient resting, the flour-dusted pause before the stamp is applied. It feels ceremonial, almost sacred, as if, in that moment, you're speaking across millennia, not with words, but with weight and shape. A visiting researcher joins you at the counter. She's been documenting these experiments for a monograph titled Stamped by Fire, the imprint of identity in Roman bread culture. She shares a theory. Stamped loaves weren't just for logistics. They were also emotional records. A baker might have been illiterate, she says, but they knew how to read their stamp, and they wanted it to last. Of course, not all the loaves turn out well. Julia shows you a tray of what she calls failed senators, half-stamped loaves with slogans like Pax Romana, squished beyond recognition. One says Rom and then just smush. Another tried to say Concordia, but looks more like Kant. They've been dubbed bread bloopers. Still, each failed attempt teaches something about material, about technique, about patience. You glance around the lab one more time. On a shelf sits a notebook. Julia's sketches of her stamps, notes on temperature, impressions of different flour types. It mirrors what Titus Claudius Carbo did all those centuries ago. Bread cataloging continues. The crust, it seems, still whispers. You take a final bite of one of her better loaves, chewy, slightly sour, pleasantly smoky. The stamp on the bottom is clear. Hospes Vini. Welcome, traveler. You smile. The bread speaks. The hour is late now. The ovens have cooled. You find yourself once more beneath a canopy of stars, wandering through the dim hush of a Roman street after sundown. The scent of olive oil lingers faintly in the air. There's a loaf in your satchel, still warm, stamped faintly with the name you don't recognize. You didn't plan to keep it, but now you do, because in the end, all this stamping, this bureaucratic ritual pressed into dough, was about something bigger than compliance. It was about memory. You passed the shadowy outline of a bakery you visited earlier, now shuttered. The fire within reduced to orange coals. Tomorrow it will open again. Dough will be mixed. A stamp will be chosen. A loaf will rise. Someone will press their name backward, carefully into a surface that will soon harden in heat, and someone else will eat that loaf, or trade it, or leave it behind. You stop at a low stone wall and sit. Stamped bread is a strange kind of time capsule. It's not meant to last, not meant to be displayed. It was consumed, forgotten, scattered, and yet those few that survived, they speak more clearly than marble statues or bronze busts, because they were real. Practical, pressed by hands that weren't trying to be remembered, they just wanted a label lunch. Historians still argue whether this ritual of stamping changed the way Romans thought about identity. Did putting your name on a loaf make you more accountable? Did it give you pride? Did it connect you to a system so large you could barely see its edges? One fringe philosopher once wrote that the Roman bread stamp was the most honest mark of Roman civilization. Humble, replicable, and hungry. You don't know if that's true, but you like the sound of it. There's a family across the street eating dinner in a small garden. Laughter drifts over the wall. You spot a loaf on their table, ridged, neatly sliced, stamped. You can't read it from here, but that hardly matters. Someone took the time to press it. Someone paused and made a mark. You think about the stamps in Carbo's collection, the ones recovered in Pompeii, the replicas Julia presses into fresh dough. Again and again. You think about the soldier carving a personal mark into his ration, the priest wiping soot from an offering loaf, the inspector flipping bread in a Subura alley with the same seriousness as a judge, and you realize these weren't just markings. They were affirmations. I was here. I made this. This loaf matters. Even in failure, the smudged conch, the warped packs, the loaves with no stamps at all. There's a story. Someone tried. Someone showed up, pressed down, and sent a message forward. A message that somehow made it all the way to you. You rise. Finally, the bread in your bag cools against your hip. Its stamp is faint. It'll probably fade by morning, but you'll remember it. The way it caught the light, the way it hummed with quiet defiance. In a city of emperors and monuments, it was the bakers, the stampers, the scribes, the loaf flippers who kept things standing, not with glory, with repetition, and now, perhaps, with sleep. So here you are. The fires have dimmed. The ink has dried. The stamps, those patient little symbols of daily effort, have all been pressed, set and cooled. You can still feel the weight of that one loaf in your hand. Can't you? Still imagine the heat of the oven, the quiet breath before the imprint, the way the letters bloomed just slightly as the crust rose. Let all of that settle now. Let the flour dust fall gently through your thoughts like fine sand. The Roman world, for all its turmoil and triumph, found order in the most ordinary things. Bread was their constant, and they treated it with more formality than we often give to entire meals. You don't need to remember every Latin inscription, every quirky abbreviation, every stamp passed down through soot and time. You just need to remember how it felt. That moment when a baker pressed his name into something soft and fleeting and gave it permanence. Let your breath slow. Let your shoulders soften. You've wandered through warm ovens, smoky courtyards, libraries filled with clay and parchment. You've walked side by side with slaves, bakers, inspectors, and scholars, all linked by crust and ink and memory. And now the stamps sleep. The ovens are cool. The bread is gone. But the story remains. Sweet dreams.